Hello and welcome back to Azure Terraformer. Today I'm going to start a new series where I play more with Azure Functions. You might remember I started this, or I teased at this series back on the 4th of July when I declared freedom from infrastructure. Today we're going to explore those ideas further, this time with a twist, using GitHub and GitHub Actions. So this is a multi-part series. I think, logical structure, the first goal, usually when I set up a project, is to set up the GitHub repo, set up the Terraform to provision the baseline environment, and get a scaffolding set in place for my GitHub action that runs the continuous deployment process. Now, it won't be a complete continuous deployment process, but as you'll see, I'm going to add to that YAML file throughout this series, and probably add a couple other additional YAML files to do different things to implement my Git flow. But for this episode, I'm basically going to be stubbing out the baseline infrastructure, so to speak, or lack thereof. I mean, these are all basically serverless services on Azure that have no VMs involved whatsoever. But we are hitting the ARM control plane to provision these things. So it may give perception that there's infrastructure, but the reality is, even serverless, you have to have an environment. There has to be like a place where your function is deployed. So that's basically what I'll be configuring today. So without further ado, let's get started. I am starting completely from scratch. So we might fast forward through some of this. Let me just set up a new project.
A few moments later.
So I've cloned the repo, I've got things set up. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is set up my GitHub Actions workflow folder. So it's in a hidden folder called GitHub, and then workflows. And then I'm just going to create a little file called cd.yaml. So that's the basic thing that I need. I need another top level root folder, which is where I'm going to keep source code. I am going to keep multiple types of source code. So I am going to create another little folder called Terraform. And we'll probably add, depending on the function that I'm going to deploy, this is going to be a .NET function, of course. I'll probably add a folder for .NET. I could go ahead and add that right now. And let's just throw in a readme.md in each folder. Okay, so from a Terraform standpoint, I really just need a very basic setup. So I'm going to start with my versions.tf file. And I won't bore you with the details. We are going to be using a backend. We are going to be using an Azure RM, the Azure RM provider. That's a big shock. So I'll go stub all that stuff out. These are the standard input variables that I use for most projects, just to help me blow out a consistent naming convention. We might add additional variables as we see fit, just to control things a little bit better, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I usually, set a default region, so I can at least set the default region. Maybe I'll even set the application name to be like an example, Azure Terraformer, and environment name, I guess I could set that as well. Of course, that would probably be best set inside of the CD, but we'll see. We'll see how I feel about that. Again, this is a little bit of a skunk works, so we'll just get this going. So now, of course, I need a resource group. So all of my resources within this function will get deployed into this resource group. If I was going multi-region, I might choose a different strategy here, but we're going very basic, single region monorepo strategy here. So when I say monorepo, I'm also going to be putting in place an Azure Function app service plan in the same repo. Now, this isn't normally how I do it, but just to get things started, I wanted to get a mono repo going where, I've got an app service plan and a multitude of Azure functions hosted in one repo. That's what I mean when I say mono repo. But there is another strategy where you break out the functions into their own repo. And in that case, your app service plan and corresponding shared infra would go into its own repo, kind of like an own infrastructure thing and its own Terraform apply. So here I got one resource group. This is going to be where all the things live. And I think the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start adding the Azure Function stuff that I need. So now it is a little bit tricky. So I'm going to go to the documentation. I highly recommend you go read the manual and go check this stuff out for yourself. When you go look at functions, right, there's going to be the function app, and then there's going to be a Linux function app and a Windows function app. This is kind of like what you see within the virtual machine model of Azure, Azure RM. There is a generic VM, and then a Linux and a Windows VM. The same thing appears to have happened with functions. And as a result, you need to go with the most updated ones, which are the Linux and Windows flavors. Do not opt for this basic one. I think it even gives you maybe a little message here that says these are going to be deprecated, so don't use them if you want to be forward compatible. So definitely start with the Linux or Windows function app. In this case, I'm going to start with the Linux app here. Now, you'll see in the example that there's a storage account needed, an app service plan. The storage account is actually a helper resource that the function apps use when they provision themselves and set up basic logging. Although this is a required resource, we're going to be doing some additional things from a logging standpoint that's going to make things a little bit nicer. But I do need all these things. I'm going to use the example, and you'll see on my channel that I use the examples a lot, just as kind of a starter when I'm working with new resources. Of course, I've worked with these resources before, but I'm doing this for your benefit. So you can see how I work and discover new things within the provider. Don't be ashamed to take, one of these examples. Now, full disclosure, a lot of these examples are not super great, and it's a great opportunity for you to give back to the community. If you see an example that's bad or needs to be updated, this is a great opportunity for you to go and contribute back to the community. By making those improvements. No Golang required. All you need to know is good old HCL. So anyways, I'm going to drop this stuff in here. Of course, I can't stand any of this stuff. Example everywhere. We need to think about the names for these things. This is a storage account that will be used exclusively for function apps. So I'm going to call this functions. This is my app service plan. It's going to be the only one. I'm going to call it main. I think Y1 is a consumption plan. You probably want to go look at this resource specifically, and it might give you more details. Also, this is a big pitfall. Like, you might see the Azure App Service Plan and the Azure Service Plan. You definitely want to be using the Service Plan, not the App Service Plan. I know I call it the App Service Plan, but the resource name changed. I'm not quite sure why. But the new one is the service plan. The old one is the app service plan. So do not use that guy. I've made that mistake before. So there's lots of different SKUs. Basically, from my memory, Y1 is the Azure Functions consumable plan. EP1, EP2, EP3 are Azure Functions premium plans, which is not the same thing as like provisioning your own virtual machines and running it. It's reserved capacity at that with a certain hardware profile, which allows you to have your Azure Functions to have access to more memory and more local storage and things like that. The rest of these are if you want to set up traditional app service plans, host traditional app services or containers or things like that. And kind of reuse the same app service plan for traditional projects and Azure Functions and containers and all the things. So basically, it's like you could set up a party cluster. But I'm going to be focusing on the consumable and the premium plans for Azure Functions in this series. So we're just going to stick with that. And since I'm pretty happy with that, I'm going to leave it like that. Now I'm going to get these names kind of cleaned up. I probably will need a rando for my storage account, which I neglected when I started this project. So this is going to be my little random string that generates a name. And I'm going to go drop that onto my, and I actually don't know if I'm going to need that. But I do know that I will need my application and environment name, and we'll start using that to kind of name these things. Of course, storage accounts, most annoyingly, do not support hyphens, and they need to be extremely short. So I may have to drop this down to using the random string. But for right now, we're just going to leave it like that. My app service plan, I can leave the hyphen. Hyphens are okay in app service plans. And my function, I can leave that as well. So now when I have multiple functions that are part of the same application and the same environment, I usually use the prefix going from bigger to smaller. Now this is just me. In the United States, we do addresses differently, but in every other country around the world, you start bigger and you get smaller. And for me, this makes sense in a naming convention because when I'm looking down a list of resources, everything's the same until you get further to the right. That's just how I do it. And so if I've got a whole bunch of functions that are part of this application in this environment, it would make sense to me that I've got this little function out here, doing foo, right? And then I might have another one out here doing bar, and then I can see, okay, all of these I got foo and I got bar, and they're both part of this stack. But of course, I don't need two functions, I just need one. So we're just gonna roll with that right now. Now my apps, I need to update these references. So we've got, now you might be asking, why did I call the app service plan main, but my storage account functions? Well, the answer is very simple. This is a convention that I use, which is basically saying, if I'm only gonna have one type of that resource within this Terraform scope, then it's my main resource. It's my main squeeze. So I just call it main. Some people call it like this. That feels weird to me, being a C# and Java developer, which might be the reason why they do it, oddly. But main to me feels more in line with like what's going on. This is the main resource of this type in this repository, or in this in the scope of this module. And if I'm going to have more than one of them, I will definitely use a different name. So storage account, I might have a storage account that I use for queue storage. I might have a storage account that I use for actual data storage that my functions consume, etc. And so that's kind of the thinking behind my naming convention there. So my app service plan is definitely going to go into the resource group. My storage account's got to go into the resource group. My storage account's got to go into the resource group. And my function has to go into the resource group. Beautiful. Now, the last thing that I'm going to do, maybe this might not be the last thing I'm going to do, but I want to set up an application insights. So let's go, because I do want to, I'm not going to configure, where is it? There it is, okay. I'm not going to configure all the application insights today. I'm not going to do coding yet with my function, but I do want to have this stuff in place so that I'm ready to use it when the time comes. And I can do some of the configuration right here in HCL to set up the Azure function so that the Azure function, once I deploy it, can talk to my app insights. So here we go. And app insights is like one of the easiest things to kind of set up resource-wise. There's really not a lot going on here, of course, in default configurations, but there are different bells and whistles that you can configure in terms of data retention, and replication and things like that. But there are other resources like sub resources that can set up interesting things like health probes and things like that. Did this not get saved? Okay. So I've got my App Insights. I got my Azure Function. I have my resource group. I probably should add a key vault. So let's go look at my key vault. And I'm gonna dump the nested thing there, because if you've seen my other videos about Key Vault, which I haven't really done like an in-depth series on Key Vault, because Key Vault's just one of those services that I use a lot, but it's not one of those things that like just sits on its own. Now, one thing I am missing is the client config, so I should probably drop that into main. So I do have that handy here. This is one of those things that is reusable across the entire scope of the module, so I drop it into main for easy access. So that shores up that. I'm gonna use this, I gotta reference my resource group. I gotta fix the name here. And let's go grab my naming convention. And there we go. So yeah, so I got my key vault. So I do need a key vault access policy. So if I go here, so this key vault access policy is going to grant my Terraform user and other things. Like I'm eventually going to add a managed identity for, we'll call this Terraform user. And this is going to my main key vault, because of course I only need one. Data client, object ID. So I'm not using the service principal, so I can just use, current. This is the current object ID. And for right now, I'm just going to give Terraform access to all these things. Okay, that's it. So we can create secrets with Terraform. That's pretty much it. Now you will want to have a depends on if you create secrets within this module, which we will later, on this access policy. Otherwise, you're going to have first time apply failures. We can talk about that a little bit later. So let's set up a managed identity that our Azure functions are going to use. And get these things going. User assigned identity. So we're going to drop this in there, and this will be a managed identity that our functions can use. So we'll call this functions, and we'll call this managed identity. Drop all that stuff, and we'll say functions. Now you could get crazy. I'll just use FN as the thing there. You could get crazy and you could, create a different managed identity for each function if you really want to control what each function can do. For simplicity, I'm just adding this right here, and let's group this together. So we've got storage account, user assigned identity, and functions. And so now I have to go add that to the identity block down here for the Azure function. So I need to set it to be, I'm going to allow it to do system assigned, and I'm going to do user assigned. So some Azure subsystems, as we found out in my Azure monitor agent video, require system assigned. So I think it is a good idea to leave system assigned on there, and then also include your own managed identity, Azure RM, user assigned identity, and I believe it's just the ID that we need. Okay, let me double check this this value. It's one of those weird ones. It feels like there should be a comma there, but but there probably doesn't need to be a comma there. It's probably just janky like that. So here's the idea. See, there is a comma. It does want a comma. Okay, so we need to have a comma there. I'm glad I asked. Wonderful. And let's go to Key Vault and let's go add an access policy for our Azure function. So the object ID is going to be coming off of this managed identity now, instead of the current user functions. And I think you want the principal ID, pretty sure. And my Azure function does not, of course, need to do all these crazy things. It doesn't even need to do a list, because the Azure function should know what secrets it wants to get. So I'm just going to give my Azure function a get. Okay, so I think I have all the things. Starting at the top, I've got my main resource group. I have a key vault, which appears to be correctly configured. I have my app insights, which appears to be correctly configured. I have my user-assigned identity set up for my functions and attached to my guy right there. I have my app service plan. Oh, there is one thing that I forgot to do. And that's on my Azure. And that's on my Azure function. In the app settings, I do need to set a couple of settings. So one is website run from package, because we are going to be deploying a code package, a zip file that is going to have all the things. And then I also need my app, and I'm just going to grab this. I'm going to need my app insights instrumentation key that I'm going to get from my Azure RM app insights instrumentation key. That should be pretty good. Now the site config does have some things in here that I do know right off the bat. My application stack is going to be .NET version 6.0. And then I do plan on doing some testing within the Azure portal. So I'm going to add CORS setting to allow the Azure portal to talk to my function. There we go. So application stack, app settings, this is what we need to get app insights connected to this Azure function. Ooh, the name of the function is really bad. I'm going to make it better by calling it foo. And there we go. I think we should be good. So next episode, I'm going to get into my CD pipeline with GitHub Actions. We're going to set up Terraform state. We're going to configure the repo, and we're going to provision this all of this stuff, which is going to be a baseline environment for my .NET 6 Azure function to be deployed into. After that, I'm going to get into some C# solution setup and coding to get just a basic, very simple vanilla Azure function out the door, and we'll go from there. So I hope you like this series. If you do, smash that like button and consider subscribing, because there's a lot more coming. Where we're going to get out the door, up and running with .NET 6 Azure functions using Terraform. Anyways, that's it for me, the Azure Terraformer, signing off.